Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to Versus Stars podcast. All my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember, click the subscribe button, everybody. It's an amazing episode because Doug Wagner boards the mothership. He's the writer of Klik Klik Boom from Image Comics. Come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Wagner. Thank you so much for coming to the Versus Stars podcast.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here.
It's totally my pleasure. So I always start out with a question of inspiration. So inspire your love of comics and who your earliest influences.
Oh man, that's always a tough one. I grew up loving comics. I'm old enough to be able, to remember picking stuff up at 7-Eleven off the spinner rack. Started with like Casper and Flintstones and stuff like that, and eventually like morphed into superhero stuff, especially like Avengers and Fantastic Four, and then discovered the Uncanny X-Men, which is probably still, my biggest influence to this day. So, if you're talking about influences, especially in comics, obviously Chris Claremont was probably my biggest influence as a writer. Some of the stuff, I'll be honest, like there for a longest time, Uncanny X-Men was my only thing. And then I kind of branched into like Frank Miller, obviously when The Dark Knight Returns came out, that was a fantastic and a huge influence. Really got into the indie scene. So a lot of stuff from like Dark Horse. So back in that day, it was a lot of like, I'm trying to think, The Mark and The American, and there was a lot of stuff back then that I just really loved. Alien Legion was another one that was a huge influence on me. I'm still like a monster fan of Larry Stroman to this day because of that book. So in comics, those were probably my biggest influences.
You know what I'd really like about that is that when you talk about what you start off with, like Casper, things of that nature, it really does tell you like the importance of these young audience books and have that we need more of them, I think, in the industry, because that is where these kids, audiences are going to come from.
Yeah, and I think I'm with you on that. I think the tougher part with that is like now that we've kind of gone to just a direct market, I wouldn't have known about comics if it wouldn't have been for 7-Eleven. There's no way around that. And I think especially with the kids comics, I think that's where we really could use branching out and making sure those are in stores like Walmart and grocery stores, because that's where I discovered them. And it was just one of those, it was a complete impulse, right? Like you were walking and you're like, oh, what's Casper about? And you flip through it and you're like, hey, Dad, I need this. And so in a comic shop, I think that's a lot more difficult to grab those younger readers that age than it is today, or than it was then.
I would say I also missed the idea of the spinner rack. I think it's a lovely idea, and especially I think if you could also get the price point with the younger audience books back down to like $2.99 instead of like $4.99. Because you gotta make it at a price point where the parents are like, all right, just shut up if I'll buy you the stupid comic, instead of let me think about it. That's a worthwhile purchase at this price. Yeah, but I think you're right 100% that you need to put it where the young people are going to be, where they're following around their parents and the parents are just trying to get rid of them for like 5-10 minutes while they go shopping, get what they really want. That's where the audience comes from. And I think even if you lose a little bit of money in the short term, you may have a reader that you have now for the next 20, 30. I mean, it never goes out of your blood. So maybe 40 years of their life, you'll have them nabbed.
I mean, we're obviously, perfect examples of like, once you get us hooked, we're in. And it's, it's been a lifelong thing ever since.
It is hard. I mean, it's like crack. Because I mean, even when financial gets a little tight, I'm like, I need to stop selling my comic books. But I'm thinking to myself, which ones though? I've been buying some of these for 10, 15, 20 years. I can't let them go.
Same. Yep, exactly the same.
So when did you think, I can actually write comic books successfully? Because that's a bit of a transition from I love comic books to, I can actually pull this off and do it.
I mean, in high school, I was completely clueless as to where I wanted to go. Coming into my senior year, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And as luck would have it, I actually went to high school with Cully Hamner. Was drawn, obviously the Blue Beetle movies coming out. He's been doing comics for decades. And he was drawn back then. And I happened to be sitting next to him. And I was like, hey, do you like comics? And back then, that was kind of like you had to keep it a secret.
Oh, yeah.
And, and so like we started talking, and honestly, we just started kind of creating our own comics. And it took me a while to realize like we were writing comics, like we were actually doing what, and when we loved it. And so at 17, I went, I think this is what I want to do. I think this is my calling. And, much to the chagrin of my parents, because, anytime you're like, hey, I want to go in a creative field, especially as something as niche as comics, they're like, that's a really tough road to pull off. And it was, it took me a good 20 years to kind of like get to where, I actually kind of broke in and started doing it regularly. But yeah, at 17 is when I decided I want to do it. And then I'm pretty hard headed. So then it was just like, I'm going to keep on this path until I make it happen.
Yeah, 20 years for, doesn't probably seem as long as as you would think with the number, because I think a lot of us in the comic book world, if we can even make it in 20 years, we'd be thinking to ourselves, totally worth 100%
Yeah.
worth it.
Yeah, and I mean, I love it. Luckily I made it, and I've been doing indie comics now for several years, and I got to work for DC Comics and a couple other companies, and I absolutely adore what I do. I mean, is it tough? Yes, but I love what I do.
Now, was it difficult at what point did you realize you could actually do it full time? I mean, because obviously at some point you had to make that decision of, I can make the gamble, quit whatever it is you're doing. I once said the real world, but your regular job. I move into comic books full time.
I mean, to be honest with you, that's always still a struggle because I
Mm,
mean, as you know, in comics, like it's like feast or famine.
yep.
So it's like you have to wait for the next book to come out because I'm not doing a monthly book. I'm usually doing miniseries, and so there might be 3 to 6 months where there's no income coming from that in at all,
Mm,
and then you hope the next book does well enough to make up for that. So it's kind of one of those things where I think especially a lot of comic book creators, we kind of go through that like every couple of months. You're like, am I sure? Like, should I be applying to work at the library or Taco Bell or something? So yeah, it's still a struggle to like to try to maintain, like the income coming in somewhat regularly. Um, but I mean, you just got to the point to where like you were making enough money to like you go, oh, wait a minute, I just got a check. There was like 1 month where I got a check for 30 grand, and you're like, okay, now I can quit my regular job as
yeah.
long as I'm smart with this money. It's like make sure you hoard it and like take good care of it. And then of course it always helps, I mean, obviously I've got a wife and she kind of has a regular job too, so that kind of helps fill in the gaps.
A very tolerant wife, I
Oh yes,
imagine.
very, very tolerant. Yes.
So, like right now, we're about to talk about your new book, "Klik Klik Boom," which is being published through Image Comic Books.
Hmm.
So, what is the benefit of publishing through Image versus going full indie?
Yeah, there's always like with every company, there's different, ups and downs and pros and cons for each. And you just have to make this decision. And for me, Image Comics is still the third largest publisher in
Yeah.
the industry. So there's something about having the Image eye on your book that immediately gives you street cred in the
Mm,
store. And so obviously I think most of the time your book's going to sell more if it's going through Image than if it's going through any of the other companies.
mm,
Image also takes care of, like they handle the printing, they've got a production department, they help you with distribution. If I was doing it completely on my own, then I've got to apply to Diamond or Lunar or whoever, now it's even more complicated, right?
yes.
And then, try to make a deal with them and see if they'll even approve my book to come out. And then I'm in the catalog with 500 other comics coming out that month. And again, when you're with Image, people look at that first. So that's the biggest, and also that's the biggest benefit with Image. And also you get to keep all of your rights for Image. Like basically if the book doesn't make money, you don't make money. But
Mm,
the great thing about Image is like if you're working on any kind of movie deal or merchandising deal or anything that might come along down the road, you own 100% of it. Where with
mm,
like a lot of the other companies, say Boom or Dark Horse, who are, and I'm friends with those guys too, and I love them. But if you go with them, they're going to give you money because they want half of it.
yeah.
So, you got to kind of figure out like what's your take, like what path you want to walk. And it's not a right or wrong answer. It's just a complete opinion on, the creator and the team and what they want to do.
Kind of interesting when you talk about Image and the idea of having that eye on your book. I find it surprising that sometimes there is a debate in the indie world, and I don't know why it's a debate, but apparently it is, that as a writer, you're not also in the promotion business. I imagine as a comic book writer, your other side gig is not whatever job you have on the side; it's the promoting of your own book.
Oh yeah, I mean that's a tough one. I mean, because I don't think writers are intuitively marketers because we like to stay in our little cave and write, right? Like we're not
Yeah.
used to dealing with people. So that's a really tough one. I mean, trying to promote your own book in this day and age is, I think, tougher than maybe, even though we've got social media and all that kind of stuff, I think it's still tougher than it's ever been because now there's so much noise that you're
Yes.
competing with. And, the marketing. And then usually, if you're the writer, you're also the manager of the whole team. You're
Yes.
in charge of like, I got to make sure the artist is turning his stuff in right. Oh, where's the colorist? Oh, where's the letterer? Oh, wait a minute, I've got to handle, I got to deal with all the production team too. Like, hey, what do you think about the credits page? So, like
Yeah.
usually half of my day is dealing with just the managerial style stuff and the promotion. So, it's, yeah, you're right. I mean, the indie world part of that is like you're on your own, like, and you got to manage the whole team.
And that must be the craziest part. And as going back to the idea of promotion, how much time do you need to spend to properly promote a book, do you think?
This is a question that I'm not sure anybody in the industry has solved.
Mm,
Um, we can argue about like Skybound and Kirkman and how they do a wonderful job and how they promoted their stuff over the years. Todd McFarlane is somehow a master genius at
mm,
making what he works. But like I would argue that like even the big two, Marvel and DC, struggle with promoting books and making them successful.
mm.
It's easy, you see, it's easy to push Batman, right? I mean, you almost don't even have to promote Batman.
Yeah.
But what I'm talking about is like take their lower tier books, and some of them like I'll see something on the stands and go, I didn't even know this was coming out,
Yes.
and this is from DC or Marvel. So what chance, like when you're talking about us, the indie guys, and Image and Boom and everybody else, like what chance do we have to punch through that noise to
Yeah.
get anybody to pay attention to our book? And that's I'm not sure anybody solved it, but like I probably spend, especially when the book's coming out, probably 4 to 6 hours a day, like
Mm.
6 days a week, trying to do something on social media or talking to somebody or, doing an article or something like that just to try to get the word out.
Now, how much more complicated has things have become on social media? Because with the kind of the fall of Twitter a little bit, you now have the rise of this a numerous number of other platforms trying to get, you have Hive, Mastodon, Blue Sky, I think it's the new one that's out there. Spoutable's out there, Tribal's out there. How complicated has that made promotion as well?
Oh, it seems to be like exponential every year.
Yes.
For me, I kind of stick to the true four for me because I'm not a TikTok kind of guy. So like, this is so I'm like Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and still Twitter. And
Mm.
those are my four. Trying to add to that would probably add hours to my day. So there's where I have to balance. To me, it's like, okay, yeah, maybe it's smart to promote more, but then again, like when am I going to have time to write? Because I've got to manage both of those. So it's a tough,
Mm.
and again, there's no right or wrong decision here. It's just you have to make a decision. Like, okay, I need time to write, so I can't do all of the social medias.
Right, right. So your new book, as we were saying, is Klik Klik Boom. So what inspired the creation of the series?
Oh, this one, honestly, I mean, it's always funny how the muses and whether it's God, the universe, whatever people like to talk about. I like the muses because it's fantastical and it makes it sound like it's magical when it's, well, some of it is. Um, you never know where the muses are going to speak to you. And I was at San Diego Comic Con a couple of years ago, believe it or not, and I saw this picture of this lady laying on a bed of nothing but Polaroids. And the idea kind of came to my head of like, why would she be laying like in this day and age? Why would she be laying in a bed of Polaroids? Like,
Right, right.
and so, of course, my mind as a writer just kind of starts running with it. And I was like, well, maybe that's the only way she can communicate. And so that kind of like, how could that be possible? Like, why would Polaroids be the only way somebody can communicate? So then the story kind of started building itself around that. And then it just became this fun, like, oh yeah, she only communicates through Polaroids because that's the only thing she understands. And oh, by the way, of course, we got to throw her in the middle of like making her basically an assassin.
So the writer in the book is another Doug. You got Doug Dabbs. Am I saying the
Yep,
name right? Doug
you
Dabbs.
did. Yep.
All right, fantastic. Points for me. So how did this partnership come about, and what does Doug bring to the table?
Doug and I met years and years ago. Like for a couple of years, I was a member of Gaijin Studios. And we actually had interns, and so that was back in Atlanta. And he was going to SCAD at the time, and he applied for the intern program, and we accepted him. And so that's kind of how I met Doug and just became friends. I'm still friends with all the interns, love them all to death. That's what's great about that whole thing. And then we just kind of like kept in touch. We've been friends for years. When we were doing the ride Burning Desire, we were doing a bunch of backup stories, and we had one gap left. So I called Doug and said, "Hey, do you want to fill this up?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'd love to." So we did the 6-page story there. Enjoyed working so much together that we decided to continue it. And I was like, "Hey, let's do a create our own thing." And so, went through some ideas. He loved this one and jumped on it. And I mean, for me, what Doug brings to the table is he's an incredible artist. Like
Mm.
he should be doing professional comics. So I feel like I got lucky, like getting on the ground floor, because he's, if you've seen his illustrations, like he's magnificent. Um, and so I was like, hey, you think you can do this in a comic? And he's like, yeah. And so that's kind of where we jumped on. He's great at storytelling. He's great at collaborating. He's really easy to work with. And so it was just, we were same mindset. We're like, hey, what do we want to do with this? We want to do an action story with kind of the feeling of Fargo or Old Country, No Country for Old Men.
Yes.
And he and I both love those series. And it's like, well, can we pull that off in a comic and an action book? And so that's what we ran with, and so hopefully it translates into the comic, and that's what we're trying to do.
Now, now I do some writing on the side as well. Not as such as you, but I do. And one thing I know about writers, or at least I think about writers, is that we're all kind of control freaks a little bit about our own stories.
Oh yeah.
Now you have a story that's a lot of it's being told or expressed through these Polaroids on. So it's very visual. So you're giving a lot of control of storytelling to the other Doug, to Doug number 2.
Right.
How stressful is it to be like, to give that over to him and be like, you need to express, where I can't say in dialogue, with these images, because that goes with your character? How difficult is that?
I mean, for me, that wasn't, because here's where I have a tendency to control it through the script itself.
Mm.
So I'm very, I'd be very descriptive about what I wanted and what what the Polaroid needed to be, tight shot on the Polaroid. And here's exactly what's in the Polaroid. And I've learned over the years to be very specific about what the vibe and emotion is in that panel. I think that's a key point, because a lot of times we'll be like, oh, Galactus keeps talking. Well, for the artists, like, I think they kind of need to know what Galactus is feeling. So I think, for me, I've learned over the years, like, if you can give that to the artist, they go, oh, I can build on that. And so, although I do trust Doug, Doug number 2, I'm still very, there's still control in the script. As you were pointing out, we are very, very controlling and very protective of our babies. So in my script, I was still very controlling and very protective.
So how do you using the images to define her character? Oh, Sprout. We should say her name. Sprout is the
Sprout.
protagonist.
You mean as far as the Polaroids, or just imagery in general?
Imagery in general, because once again, you're relying more on what you're seeing than dialogue. Because for the readers who might not know, she's mute.
Yeah. I mean, that's the fun part, is like I get to experiment with this character and do everything, because the comics is first a visual medium. So like that's where I put all my focus and went, okay, how can I be as expressive with just what she's doing and expressing, and emoting, as I would if I was using dialogue. So in this case, with like the first issue, we've got her in a dance club. She changes her complete look almost every time we see her. She's like, oh, I'm going to try a different wig and do these kind of things. And so that was where, like, had fun. And then the interactions she has with other people, where like, where people are like, they don't know she's mute. Like it opens up where, like she's staring at a birthday cake because she's never seen a birthday cake before. This family's like, you need to go. And she's like, she doesn't understand. But, that kind of interaction kind of lets you know, and how she reacts to that is where I think you get to like deliver what the character's about.
So which elements of her character did you put in place so the readers can kind of like latch on and empathize with her?
I think two things. So, and this is the kind of like fun thing about Sprout, is there's 2 parts to this story. There's the part of she's here to avenge the only person she's ever known and loved, which is her grandfather. And so I think everybody can relate to like, oh, I had this person in my life, whether it's your grandfather, your mom, your dad, a brother, whatever it might be. And if somebody murdered them, they're going to pay. I think everybody can relate to that. Classic story of revenge, throughout time. The other part I wanted to play with, which was an interesting part to throw in there, was this. She's never been in a big city. She's never seen the things. She's no TV, no experience with any of this stuff. And so I didn't want to play that like she's scared of it, more of like, oh my God, how much of this can I take in a day? It's like if you went to New York City for the first time and you've never seen all this food, I know me, I would probably end up sick at the end of the day, because I'm eating street dogs, I'm eating tacos, I'm eating everything I can get my hands on. So I kind of wanted to incorporate that and have this like dichotomy of her, like she's enjoying and sucking in everything she can in life, but at the same time she's there for a mission, like she's there to take care of something.
So as you're saying, because so much of the background, and part of the story is that the background is that it takes place in New York, New York City, So how much of a character is New York itself in the book?
Oh yeah, dude. I mean, I preach this all the time when I'm, doing talks, and I've taught for a while. Um, Environment is a character, and if you don't embrace that in your writing, like it's going to fall flat. Like you think of stuff like Mad Max Fury Road, right? Like, I mean, think about how magnificent that environment is, and it adds as a character to the whole
Mm,
thing. And so, what I love about New York City, and I've been there a couple of times, is it is a character,
mm,
and with all these layers, right? And like you can go to New York City and experience almost everything the entire world has to offer. That's what's incredible about that city.
mm.
And it almost feels like its own planet. It's so massive. And so being able to throw a character in there and go, okay, how does New York City, in my head, I'm thinking, what does New York City think about Sprout? And New York City is like, I'm glad you're here. Let me show you everything.
Mm.
So like that's the fun part of like it's almost like another, mentor style character of going, let me teach you about life.
So for any of our listeners who have been to New York, are they gonna see anything that they recognize?
Oh yeah, if you're in there and you jump in there, you're going to see a ton of stuff. We Doug Dabs and I both threw in a bunch of stuff. And we wanted to keep it more street level instead of just going with like, oh, here's the Statue of Liberty and here's the
Mm.
Empire State Building. It's more like here's suburbs. Here's like the classic suburbs, and here's the classic like here's warehouse, the warehouse district. That looks totally different than the rest of the city. So, it's just that, even at one point, like we go out to the outskirts of, the suburbs were like these massive mansions, that don't look like they fit in something like New York City, where they're almost their own forest, right? Like it's like just massive.
Mm.
But want to kind of like show the different layers of New York City.
So in the first issue, Sprout's grandfather is training Sprout in Idaho. He discusses training as preparing for war. So who's he preparing for war against?
Well, for him, and you'll learn, as we, and this isn't major spoilers, but as you learn with him, like he's a Vietnam veteran and he has PTS. And so like and I grew up with a lot of these men. My dad was in the army. So I grew up with a lot of these men that had come back from Vietnam War, and you get to see what they come back, and it's hard for them to let go of it. And that's what I kind of
Mm.
wanted to embrace here is like for people that have been in something this horrible, they come back and they almost can't let it go. And that's
Mm.
that's her dad, or her grandfather here is he's like, I need to train you because like the Vietnam War to him isn't over. And he
Mm.
needs to make sure that this young girl is strong enough and trained enough to survive it.
So obviously, like I'm saying, he's kind of a survivalist, trying to teach her how to survive, but at the same time doing it in kind of a violent kind of, teach her to be an assassin with weaponry, stuff like that. So overall, is his influence on Sprout more positive or more negative?
I mean, obviously we can get into debate into nurturing, but like for me, it's more positive because he's still a very loving man. And I think even at a young age, and hopefully this comes across in the story we're doing, um, she accepts him for his flaws.
Mm.
He's still a very loving, kind-hearted person who thinks he's at war. So, what kind of walls do you build up when you think at every corner somebody's going to kill you?
Mm.
But, you still have this good heart. So she knows that he loves her with all his heart. But he has these episodes where he flips out and thinks he's still in Vietnam, and that's what I experienced as a teenager. I was
Mm.
hanging out with these men and they'd be like, I mean, I was taking stuff straight from what happened. A lot of this was just straight from what me and my friends experienced hanging out with our dads, and you're like,
Mm.
oh, wait a minute. Um, my dad thinks we're in Vietnam, and I'm not sure whether he thinks I'm on his side or not. Like you're like, oh God, it's like, I mean, there was a great story when I was growing up, and a group of us were out with one of our dads, and we're just going through the woods, and he took a gun everywhere he went. He always had an AR-15 with him,
Mm.
and it's pretty quiet. We're just having a fun time hiking through the woods. He comes to a stop, and he clicks the safety off of his weapon, and that was the loudest click I've ever heard in my life because it was just like one of those things where you're like, your brain went, oh shit, he thinks we're in the middle of a fight. And I don't know what that means for me.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
So like that's the kind of stuff like I really wanted to try to put in these flashbacks of Sprout and her grandfather is like, hey, this is what PTSD does to people.
Mm. Well, I mean, obviously she's with her grandfather, so that opens the question of where her parents are at the moment.
Oh
So what's
yeah,
going
yeah.
on there?
Yeah, but that's for another day. Yep,
Okay.
we're not giving that up. Yeah.
So obviously, you said because he has PTSD, he's kind of in and out on his feeling of whether or not he's still in Vietnam or not in Vietnam. So on the days that he not the better, let's say he's doing better on his good days, does he feel his training is going to lead Sprout to danger, or is it protection on his good days?
Oh, I think even on his good days, he knows his sole concern is to make sure she's ready for war. It's a
Okay.
protective thing.
So another character in the story that's really interesting is Serena Biggs.
Hmm.
What is important about her inclusion to the story?
I think she's kind of like our cipher for the reader because obviously, having a mute character who only communicates through Polaroids, you need somebody to kind of translate that a little bit for you. And what we kind of wanted to do with her is kind of like have this balance of like, if you notice, like Serena talks a lot. Like, and that doesn't matter whether she thinks somebody's listening or not. She talks a lot, juxtaposed with this person who can't speak. And
Yes.
so having that fun, like, and then in Sprout raised ready for war, where clearly Serena's going to be like a little bit protected, and she hasn't experienced stuff like this before. She's like, hey, I live in a big city, sure there's dangers, but I wasn't trained for war. And so like, a very comfortable existence versus somebody who was raised, in the wilderness of Idaho where they didn't see anybody. So Serena's seen all this stuff and almost kind of takes it for granted, right? Like if you're in New York City, sometimes you can go, hey, wait a minute, I don't take advantage of everything the city has to offer. Where Sprout's just embracing all of it. So that was, the fun, like, hey, let's play with this and kind of show these two different sides.
So I mean, obviously, she's has a podcast is kind of what she's pushing. Is her intent then good, or is it a selfish goal that she has?
Oh, I think, what I wanted to really embrace with Serena was that she's like the epitome of a journalist, somebody who's searching for the truth. Like we've seen, obviously in today's world things get a little fuzzy, but like back in the day, like news programs were about telling the truth and finding the truth and exposing that.
Yeah.
And I think that's Serena's sole purpose. And so like, is there obviously there's going to be like some selfishness in there because the more people that are listening to her, the more her word can get out. But at the same time, like, her true motivation is like, I want to expose the truth.
Now, because I mean, Sprout is an assassin, but she does help Serena. What does that suggest about Sprout? And once again, what are her intentions? Because she protects Serena, and I mean, obviously, there's also that connection to Minerva World Services. So, I mean, is that a deeper reason that Sprout's helping her? Is it just she's a good person and she's just going to help out? What's the deal?
Oh yeah, with Sprout, I think I do think she has a moral compass of, hey, protect the weak from the strong kind of thing. And I mean, that would go right along with what her grandfather has kind of done with her his entire life is like, protect the weak because that's what we're supposed to do. And that's your kind of your duty. Now the bad guys, they chose their path, so they get what they got.
So, how much more information are we going to get about Minerva World Services? And is there any real life corporation that we're using as our metaphor for the metaphor
Yeah,
for?
I mean, you'll get, most of the stories obviously going to be focused around Sprout and Serena and how they build up. But yeah, I mean, obviously, since Minerva World Services is the villain in the story, we'll get some more information as we go along. Um, but based on real world, some. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like I took pieces. You've got like Blackwater and
Yeah.
you've got all these kind of like, I mean, even like the Wagner group that's currently in Russia. I mean, from what I've read, this guy started with a hot dog stand, and now he owns maybe one of the three top mercenary armies in the world. And you're like, how does that work? So, it's just like there's huge corporations that are just doing things behind the scenes and keep quiet and under the radar, and they're affecting world events. And that's kind of like, almost the Illuminati style
Yep.
of things that we kind of wanted to touch on in this.
So, what can listeners look forward to in upcoming issues of Klik Klik Boom? And also, is this a mini series? Is this ongoing?
Oh, it's definitely a miniseries. So it's going to be 5 issues.
Okay.
And basically what we're looking for is, like we had a lot of fun with this is like Sprout trying to she knows the man in charge of Minerva World Services, who's basically untouchable at this point, right? How do you take somebody like that down when you're somebody who has no like resources? And so like how do you basically, how do you get that guy to come out of his shell or out of his cave? Out of his protective cave. And so you get to see like this Sprout just slowly like working her way up this chain of like, eventually you have to come face me. You have to deal with me. And the fun part with what we've done to Sprout is she basically, wherever she's at, she incorporates those whatever's around her, her environment, into basically how she fights. So as in the next issue, they're obviously in a dirty dank hotel. Well, what would you use from a dirty dank hotel as weaponry against trained mercenaries? And I'm obviously we went with dirty bed sheets and stuff like that. Just like just having fun with it, and we do that throughout the whole thing. So every time she's in a different environment, she uses a completely different weaponry in each one.
Now, is this going to be set up so after these 5 issues are over, it's set up for another potential 5 issues, or is this going to be definitely done in 5?
I mean, obviously I have to think it's just the 5. So I want to make sure that one's a self-contained story, so that if that's all that ever comes out, it's a good solid story. There's always plans for more, but it just depends on, obviously the success of the book.
Mr. Wagner, it's been an absolute honor to speak with you, sir. Klik Boom sounds awesome. And when is the next issue ready to come out?
Let's see, June 14th is when this first one came out. So I think it's July. Well, it'll be the 3rd week of July.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, sir, for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. You too.